Part 3, Chapter 10 of To Let. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Simon Evers. The Forsyte Saga 3. To Let by John Galsworthy. Part 3, Chapter 10. Fleur's Wedding. The October paragraphs describing the wedding of Fleur Forsyte to Michael Mont hardly conveyed the symbolic significance of this event. In the union of the great-granddaughter of Superior Dorset with the heir of a 9th baronet was the outward and visible sign of that merger of class in class which buttresses the political stability of a realm. The time had come when the Forsytes might resign their natural resentment against a flummery not theirs by birth, and accept it as the still more natural due of their possessive instincts. Besides, they had to mount to make room for all those so much more newly rich. In that quiet but tasteful ceremony in Hanover Square, and afterward among the furniture in Green Street, it had been impossible for those not in the know to distinguish the Forsyte troop from the Mont contingent. So far away was Superior Dorset now. Was there, in the crease of his trousers, the expression of his moustache, his accent, or the shine on his top hat, a pin to choose between Soames and the 9th baronet himself? Was not Fleur as self-possessed, quick, glancing, pretty, and hard as the likeliest Muscombe, Mont, or Charwell filly present? If anything, the Forsytes had it in dress and looks and manners. They had become upper class, and now their name would be formally recorded in the stud book, their money joined to land. Whether this was a little late in the day, and those rewards of the possessive instinct, lands and money, destined for the melting pot, was still a question so moot that it was not mooted. After all, Timothy had said consols were going up. Timothy, the last, the missing link. Timothy in extremis on the Bayswater Road, so Francie had reported. It was whispered, too, that this young Mont was a sort of socialist. Strangely wise of him, and in the nature of insurance, considering the days they lived in. There was no uneasiness on that score. The landed classes produced that sort of amiable foolishness at times, turned to safe uses and confined to theory. As George remarked to his sister Francie, "They'll soon be having puppies. That'll give him pause." The church, with white flowers and something blue in the middle of the east window, looked extremely chaste, as though endeavouring to counteract the somewhat lurid phraseology of a service calculated to keep the thoughts of all on puppies. Forsytes, Haymans, Treatymans sat in the left aisle, Monts, Charwells, Muscombes in the right, while a sprinkling of Fleur's fellow-sufferers at school and of Mont's fellow-sufferers in the war gaped indiscriminately from either side, and 3 maiden ladies who dropped in on their way from Skywards brought up the rear, together with 2 Mont retainers and Fleur's old nurse. In the unsettled state of the country, as full a house as could be expected. Mrs. Val Darty, who sat with her husband in the 3rd row, squeezed his hand more than once during the performance. To her, who knew the plot of this tragi-comedy, its most dramatic moment was well-nigh painful. "I wonder if John knows by instinct," she thought. John, out in British Columbia. She had received a letter from him only that morning which had made her smile and say, "John's in British Columbia, Val, because he wants to be in California. He thinks it's too nice there." "Oh," said Val, "so he's beginning to see a joke again." "He's bought some land and sent for his mother." "What on earth will she do out there?" "All she cares about is John. Do you still think it is a happy release?" Val's shrewd eyes narrowed to grey pinpoints between their dark lashes. "Fleur wouldn't have suited him a bit. She's not bred right." "Poor little Fleur," sighed Holly. "Ah, it was strange, this marriage. The young man, Mont, had caught her on the rebound, of course, in the reckless mood of one whose ship has just gone down. Such a plunge could not but be, as Val put it, an outside chance. There was little to be told from the back view of her young cousin's veil, and Holly's eyes reviewed the general aspect of this Christian wedding. She, who had made a love match which had been successful, had a horror of unhappy marriages. This might not be one in the end, but it was clearly a toss-up. And to consecrate a toss-up in this fashion with manufactured unction before a crowd of fashionable free thinkers, for who thought otherwise than freely or not at all when they were dolled up, seemed to her as near a sin as one could find in an age which had abolished them. Her eyes wandered from the prelate in his robes, a charwel, the Forsytes had not as yet produced a prelate, to Val, beside her, thinking, she was certain, of the Mayfly filly at 15-1 for the Cambridgeshire. They passed on and caught the profile of the 9th baronet, in counterfeitement of the kneeling process. She could just see the neat ruck above his knees where he had pulled his trousers up, and thought, "Val's forgotten to pull up his." Her eyes passed to the pew in front of her, where Winifred's substantial form was gowned with passion, and on again to Soames and Annette kneeling side by side. A little smile came on her lips. Prosper Fafond, back from the South Seas of the Channel, would be kneeling too, about 6 rows behind. Yes, this was a funny small business, however it turned out. Still, it was in a proper church, and would be in the proper papers tomorrow morning. They had begun a hymn. She could hear the 9th baronet across the aisle singing of the hosts of Midian. Her little finger touched Val's thumb. They were holding the same hymn book, and a tiny thrill passed through her, preserved from 20 years ago. He stooped and whispered, "I say, do you remember the rat?" The rat at their wedding in Cape Colony, which had cleaned its whiskers behind the table of the registrars. And between her little and third fingers she squeezed his thumb hard. The hymn was over. The prelate had begun to deliver his discourse. He told them of the dangerous times they lived in, and the awful conduct of the House of Lords in connection with divorce. They were all soldiers, he said, in the trenches under the poisonous gas of the Prince of Darkness, and must be manful. The purpose of marriage was children, not mere sinful happiness. An imp danced in Holly's eyes. Val's eyelashes were meeting. Whatever happened, he must not snore. Her finger and thumb closed on his thigh till he stirred uneasily. The discourse was over, the danger past. They were signing in the vestry, and general relaxation had set in. A voice behind her said, "Will she stay the course?" "Who's that?" she whispered. "Old George Forsyte." Holly demurely scrutinized one of whom she had often heard. Fresh from South Africa, and ignorant of her kith and kin, she never saw one without an almost childish curiosity. He was very big and very dapper. His eyes gave her a funny feeling of having no particular clothes. "They're off," she heard him say. They came, stepping from the chancel. Holly looked first in young Mont's face. His lips and ears were twitching. His eyes, shifting from his feet to the hand within his arm, stared suddenly before them as if to face a firing party. He gave Holly the feeling that he was spiritually intoxicated. But Fleur, that was different. The girl was perfectly composed, prettier than ever, in her white robes and veil over her banged dark chestnut hair. Her eyelids hovered demure over her dark hazel eyes. Outwardly she seemed all there, but inwardly where was she? As those two passed, Fleur raised her eyelids. The restless glint of those clear whites remained on Holly's vision, as might the flutter of caged birds' wings. In Green Street Winifred stood to receive, just a little less composed than usual. Soames's request for the use of her house had come on her at a deeply psychological moment. Under the influence of a remark of Prosper Profond, she had begun to exchange her empire for expressionistic furniture. There were the most amusing arrangements, with violet, green, and orange blobs and scriggles, to be had at Melard's. Another month, and the change would have been complete. Just now, the very intriguing recruits she had enlisted did not march too well with the old guard. It was as if her regiment were half in khaki, half in scarlet and bearskins. But her strong and comfortable character made the best of it, in a drawing-room which typified, perhaps more perfectly than she imagined, the semi-Bolshevized imperialism of her country. After all, this was a day of merger, and you couldn't have too much of it. Her eyes travelled indulgently among her guests. Soames had gripped the back of a buhl chair. Young Mont was behind that awfully amusing screen, which no one as yet had been able to explain to her. The ninth baronet had shied violently at a round scarlet table, inlaid under glass with blue Australian butteries wings, and was clinging to her Louis XV cabinet. Francie Forsyte had seized the new mantel-board, finely carved with little purple grotesques on an ebony ground. George, over by the old spinet, was holding a little sky-blue book as if about to enter bets. Prosper Profond was twiddling the knob of the open door, black with peacock-blue panels, and Annette's hands, close by, were grasping her own waist. Two Muscombes clung to the balcony among the plants, as if feeling ill. Lady Mont, thin and brave-looking, had taken up her long-handled glasses, and was gazing at the central light-shade of ivory and orange dashed with deep magenta, as if the heavens had opened. Everybody, in fact, seemed holding on to something. Only Fleur, still in her bridal dress, was detached from all support, flinging her words and glances to left and right. The room was full of the bubble and squeak of conversation. Nobody could hear anything that anybody said, which seemed of little consequence, since no one waited for anything so slow as an answer. Modern conversation seemed to Winifred so different from the days of her prime, when a drawl was all the vogue. Still it was amusing, which was, of course, all that mattered. Even the Forsytes were talking with extreme rapidity, Fleur and Christopher and Imogen and young Nicholas's youngest, Patrick. Soames, of course, was silent, but George, by the spinet, kept up a running commentary, and Francie by her mantel-shelf. Winifred drew nearer to the ninth baronet. He seemed to promise a certain repose. His nose was fine and drooped a little, his grey moustaches too, and she said, drawling through her smile, "It's rather nice, isn't it?" His reply shot out of his smile like a snipped bread pellet. "Do you remember in Fraser the tribe that buries the bride up to the waist?" He spoke as fast as anybody. He had dark, lively little eyes, too, all crinkled round like a Catholic priest's. Winifred felt suddenly he might say things she would regret. "They're always so amusing, weddings," she murmured, and moved on to Soames. He was curiously still, and Winifred saw at once what was dictating his immobility. To his right was George Forsyte, to his left Annette and Prosper Profond. He could not move without either seeing those two together, or the reflection of them in George Forsyte's gaping eyes. He was quite right not to be taking notice. "They say Timothy's sinking," he said glumly. "Where will you put him, Soames?" "Highgate." He counted on his fingers. "It'll make 12 of them there, including wives. How do you think Fleur looks?" "Remarkably well." Soames nodded. He had never seen her look prettier, yet he could not rid himself of the impression that this business was unnatural, remembering still that crushed figure burrowing into the corner of the sofa. From that night to this day he had received from her no confidences. He knew from his chauffeur that she had made one more attempt on Robin Hill and drawn blank. An empty house, no one at home. He knew that she had received a letter, but not what was in it, except that it had made her hide herself and cry. He had remarked that she looked at him sometimes, when she thought he wasn't noticing, as if she were wondering still what he had done, forsooth, to make these people hate him so. Well, there it was. Annette had come back, and things had worn on through the summer, very miserable, till suddenly Fleur had said she was going to marry young Mont. She had shown him a little more affection when she told him that, and he had yielded. What was the good of opposing it? God knew that he had never wished to thwart her in anything, and the young man seemed quite delirious about her. No doubt she was in a reckless mood, and she was young, absurdly young, but if he opposed her, he didn't know what she would do. For all he could tell, she might want to take up a profession, become a doctor or solicitor or some such nonsense. She had no aptitude for painting, writing, music, in his view the legitimate occupations of unmarried women, if they must do something in these days. On the whole, she was safer married, for he could see too well how feverish and restless she was at home. Annette, too, had been in favour of it. Annette, from behind the veil of his refusal to know what she was about, if she was about anything. Annette had said, "Let her marry this young man. He is a nice boy, not so highty-flighty as he seems." Where she got her expressions he didn't know, but her opinion soothed his doubts. His wife, whatever her conduct, had clear eyes and an almost depressing amount of common sense. He had settled 50,000 on Fleur, taking care that there was no cross-settlement in case it didn't turn out well. Could it turn out well? She had not got over that other boy. He knew. They were to go to Spain for the honeymoon. He would be even lonelier when she was gone. But later, perhaps, she would forget and turn to him again. Winifred's voice broke on his reverie. "Why, of all wonders, June! There, in the jibbah. What things she wore, with her hair straying from under a fillet. Soames saw his cousin and Fleur going forward to greet her. The two passed from their view out onto the stairway. "Really," said Winifred, "she does the most impossible things. Fancy her coming!" "What made you ask her?" muttered Soames. "Because I thought she wouldn't accept, of course." Winifred had forgotten that behind conduct lies the main trend of character, or, in other words, omitted to remember that Fleur was now a lame duck. On receiving her invitation, June had first thought, "I wouldn't go near them for the world," and then one morning had awakened from a dream of Fleur waving to her from a boat with a wild, unhappy gesture, and she had changed her mind. When Fleur came forward and said to her, "Do come up while I'm changing my dress," she followed up the stairs. The girl led the way into Imogen's old bedroom, set ready for her toilet. June sat down on the bed, thin and upright, like a little spirit in the sere and yellow. Fleur locked the door. The girl stood before her, divested of her wedding dress. What a pretty thing she was! "I suppose you think me a fool," she said, with quivering lips, "when it was to have been John. But what does it matter? Michael wants me, and I don't care. It'll get me away from home." Diving her hand into the frills on her breast, she brought out a letter. "John wrote me this." June read: "Lake Okanagan, British Columbia. I'm not coming back to England. Bless you always, John." "She's made safe, you see," said Fleur. June handed back the letter. "That's not fair to Irene," she said. "She always told John he could do as he wished." Fleur smiled bitterly. "Tell me, didn't she spoil your life too?" June looked up. "Nobody can spoil a life, my dear. That's nonsense. Things happen, but we bob up." With a sort of terror she saw the girl sink on her knees and bury her face in the jibbah. A strangled sob mounted to June's ears. "It's all right," she murmured. "Don't. There." But the point of the girl's chin was pressed ever closer into her thigh, and the sound was dreadful of her sobbing. Well, well, it had to come. She would feel better afterward. June stroked the short hair of that shapely head, and all the scattered mother sense in her focused itself and passed through the tips of her fingers into the girl's brain. "Don't sit down under it, my dear," she said at last. "We can't control life, but we can fight it. Make the best of things. I've had to. I held on, like you, and I cried, as you're crying now. And look at me." Fleur raised her head. A sob merged suddenly into a little choked laugh. In truth, it was a thin and rather wild and wasted spirit she was looking at, but it had brave eyes. "All right," she said. "I'm sorry. I shall forget him, I suppose, if I fly fast and far enough." And, scrambling to her feet, she went over to the washstand. June watched her removing with cold water the traces of emotion. Save for a little becoming pinkness, there was nothing left when she stood before the mirror. June got off the bed and took a pin-cushion in her hand. To put 2 pins into the wrong places was all the vent she found for sympathy. "Give me a kiss," she said, when Fleur was ready, and dug her chin into the girl's warm cheek. "I want a whiff," said Fleur. "Don't wait." June left her, sitting on the bed with a cigarette between her lips and her eyes half closed, and went downstairs. In the doorway of the drawing-room stood Soames, as if unquiet at his daughter's tardiness. June tossed her head and passed down on to the half-landing. Her cousin Francie was standing there. "Look," said June, pointing with her chin at Soames. "That man's fatal." "How do you mean?" said Francie. "Fatal?" June did not answer. "I shan't wait to see them off," she said. "Good-bye." "Good-bye," said Francie, and her eyes of a Celtic grey goggled. That old feud! Really, it was quite romantic. Soames, moving to the well of the staircase, saw June go, and drew a breath of satisfaction. Why didn't Fleur come? They would miss their train. That train would bear her away from him. Yet he could not help fidgeting at the thought that they would lose it. And then she did come, running down in her tan-coloured frock and black velvet cap, and passed him into the drawing-room. He saw her kiss her mother, her aunt, Val's wife, Imogen, and then come forth, quick and pretty as ever. How would she treat him at this last moment of her girlhood? He couldn't hope for much. Her lips pressed the middle of his cheek. "Daddy," she said, and was past and gone. Daddy! She hadn't called him that for years. He drew a long breath and followed slowly down. There was all the folly with that confetti stuff and the rest of it to go through with yet. But he would like just to catch her smile if she leaned out, though they would hit her in the eye with the shoe if they didn't take care. Young Mont's voice said fervently in his ear, "Good-bye, sir, and thank you. I'm so fearfully bucked." "Good-bye," he said. "Don't miss your train." He stood on the bottom step but 3, whence he could see above the heads, the silly hats and heads. They were in the car now, and there was that stuff showering, and there went the shoe. A flood of something welled up in Soames, and he didn't know. He couldn't see. End of Part 3, Chapter 10. Recording by Simon Evers.